Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to class today. Thank you for joining me. Whether you're watching live or you're watching the recording, I appreciate you watching. I think we'll have a good class today. I'm feeling pretty decent today, right? Got a good thing going here. I like talking about typography and fonts on the web in general. I enjoy talking about fonts. And that's what we're going to be talking about today, are fonts. So we'll talk about using fonts and kind of what fonts are and how we work with fonts and all these different sorts of things. And we'll show you, how we use fonts on websites the easy way and how we can use fonts on websites the hard way. Right, and just enjoy kind of working with fonts on websites, because really typography on the web is something that is underutilized, in my opinion. Right, I don't think that the tools in general for using type on the internet are as robust as they kind of should be. Right, when we look at traditional print design and other sort of design tools, right? When we look at things like Photoshop and Adobe InDesign and all of these tools that are created for designing other media, we see a lot of really robust tools for working with type. But on the web, type kind of seems like an afterthought. So today what I'd like to do is just kind of talk about typography just in general for a little bit, and then we'll get into just kind of working with type. I'd like to just kind of flow with type for a little bit. Do some examples, one using Google Fonts, which is kind of an easy way to use type on the web, and one where we're kind of self-hosting a font. And then just kind of get into some granular ways that we can kind of use CSS to impact type on the web. Doing things like, character spacing and all this sort of stuff to refine our type. Right, because, that's one of the things that I, in general, find that, is sort of tough to do, right? Like, even when I take a lot of time on a design, really getting it refined and really making things look deliberate really relies on my ability to make solid typographic decisions. And so that's going to be the foundation kind of what we're looking at today. So let's first start off just by talking a little bit about type. And actually, before I get into that, let me just remind you all. I believe it's coming up on Tuesday, I want to say. The 24th, so that might be Monday. Days are kind of running together in my head. I'm going to tell you guys just straight up, like the last couple of weeks in general have been kind of weird for me, just in terms of like schedule and everything that's been going on and all the stuff that's been happening around here. Right, so I've been trying to keep up with everything. Everything's just been trying to, everything's been kind of getting jumbled up. So it's the 24th, whenever the 24th is, whether it's Monday or Tuesday or Wednesday or whenever of next week. That's when registration for next week or for next semester happens, or opens up, I should say. So you'll want to make sure that you are aware of what you need to be taking in the spring. I know some of you have taken courses out of order. Some of you maybe missed some things last spring that you need to go back and take. Some of you might be ahead on some things that you've taken previously that you need to, so you might have some different options for the spring for things that you need to take. So just so we all make sure that, you get to graduate on time and you're taking the right stuff and you're doing everything properly, talk to me, right? Get in touch with me. And then we can talk about what you need to take in the spring to be able to graduate on time and be happy and move on to the next steps for you, whatever those might be. Right? Big things are happening. And we're all, super excited about the prospect of graduation. And so with that, I think that's the only announcement that I have. So now I can talk about typography on the web. And we can talk about just what exactly is type. And so really when we talk about type, we can talk about type in a lot of different ways. Right? At its core, really, basically every bullet point you see on this slide here is a different way that we can talk about type. And we can do entire courses just about typography on websites. In, typography in general and typography on websites, right? That's really, that's the thing about basically everything that we do in every single one of the classes that we have, right? If we really wanted to get granular and we really wanted to become experts in any one singular thing that we're doing, we could do entire 16-week classes on any one topic, including typography, including color, including, just basic JavaScript stuff, including user interface elements, form development, all sorts of stuff. We could basically take one singular topic that we might get to just spend a week, maybe 2, maybe 3 on, and we could teach entire classes on it. And that's what makes a lot of this stuff so challenging, right? Is this idea that a lot of these topics are so big and broad, and there's so much stuff that we could actually cover and drill down into and get really granular into when we're talking about these things. And then we, cover them maybe as part of a module for 1 week. And, that gets a little bit challenging. Typography is no exception, right? Each one of these bullet points here could be one of the things that we talk about when we talk about type. Because one of the things that we'll say a little bit later on in a slide is that type's a little bit more than just how our font looks, right? Like we'll talk about readability. And we'll talk about really how readability is 2 different things, right? Readability is whether something is able to be read and whether or not you want to read something. And these are these are 2 completely different things. But at its core, when we're talking about typography, we're really just talking about how we choose to display our written content. Hard stop, right? How we choose to display our written content. So any text that is on our sites, whether it is a heading, whether it is a list item, whether it is a paragraph, a link, any item that is text-based, right, that is written, how we choose to display that written content. And we can take each of these different written elements and we could display them differently. Right? And that's part of typography. If we want to set different elements apart, we can give them different fonts. That's one of the things that we were talking about last week when we talked about the concept of contrast. Right? When we talked about the concept of contrast, one of the things that we said we could do was we could take our heading and we could give it a completely different font than we give our body copy, right? Just to give another big visual separation between a heading and the body. Or between heading text and body text. Right? If you'll remember back to last week in the example I showed you all, right? The heading text was in this big, bold slab serif font. And the body text was just a plain, simple sans serif font. And this is how you choose to display your written content. And we can really call it the voice of your website. And we'll kind of see what that means a little bit later on, but you kind of get the feeling that you might already know what that means when we say the voice of your website. Right? Because, like when you think about it and you hear somebody's voice, when you hear somebody on the phone or you hear somebody in a video, or maybe they've walked up behind you and they've said something to you before you've turned around and looked at them, when you have said something to this person, or somebody has said something to you, typically in our minds, one of the things that we'll do is we'll kind of create this visual image of what this person looks like, right? And sometimes it is reflective of what they actually look like, and sometimes it isn't. Right? That's neither here nor there typically. Right? And so when we think about, well, okay, so when we hear somebody and we hear their voice, we kind of picture what they look like. So that means we can tie visual elements to sound. And we can also tie it back the other way, right? Like if we see somebody, we can also kind of get a picture in our mind, or we can also kind of get an audio picture in our minds of what their voice might sound like. Right, I don't have it set up, but to go through my microphone, but I actually have a voice modification program on my computer here that would actually be kind of cool if we were to run it through this. That would be kind of neat. Can I? And we'll let it go. We'll let it go for now. It'll be fine. Maybe some other time. And so when we see our font, we can kind of tie that to, this visual sort of voice print of how our website is speaking. Right? When you see a font like, say, Comic Sans, that gives you this impression. Right? And when you see a font like Times New Roman, that gives you an impression. And when you see a font like, just a basic sans serif like Verdana, that gives you an impression. Right? And this impression that you get is sort of reflective of kind of what this website sounds like. Is it kind of this, stuffy, hoity-toity, or is it like a, haha, I'm quirky, having a great time here? And you have this visual identifier with the font, and we want the visual identifier to be able to match with the tone of the content that's on our site, right? So we want to use a font that is appropriate for the tone of the content on our site. Because if we have this really, quirky, fun, lighthearted font, but then we're reporting death statistics for highway traffic accidents or whatever, we have this incongruous font that's going along with the content of the site, and it's like somebody who's, it's kind of like, putting, if you're old enough to remember Bozo the Clown from Saturday Morning television, in his full bozo act, bucket number one, whole situation on the evening news, reading that day's stories. Right? We have this, we want some congruity between the font and the content of our website. And when it comes to typography, it's more than just our font. It's the spacing around our font. It's the readability of our font. It's the usability of our text. Right? In readability, we can kind of branch out into other things, as we've mentioned. Right? We'll talk more about that in just a little bit. And we can say that if your type is bad, that your design is bad. And that lends itself back to the idea of readability and usability. Right? Because one of the things that we have said and we will say is that, the idea of readability is not only that something can be read, but that people want to read it. So if one of the big points of your website is to convey this information and it is either not being conveyed properly, or it's being conveyed incorrectly, or people are not reading your text because you have too much of it, or it's too tight together and it looks, from a perspective of cognitive ergonomics, it looks too daunting, it looks too overwhelming, it looks like too much to read, then you're actively working against yourself because of your bad typography. If your font is incongruous against your content, you're working against yourself and your design is bad. Right? Your message is, has a different tone than your font conveys. Which is also why, in general, a lot of websites just use a plain and simple sans serif font. Sans serif's easier to read digitally, and it also is just generic, right? So it's a good catch-all thing for multiple situations. But at the end of the day, we can kind of break the idea of typography down. We can see it as being a beautiful group of letters. Right? Because before we read a word, right, when we have text that's just displayed on a screen, right, our computer doesn't put meaning to anything. Right? When we think about the concept of a string in programming and development and everything that we work with, when we think about this concept of a string, right, we can kind of put it in line with this idea of if you've ever seen those birthday banners, right, where it's just a singular letter that's put up on a string. Right, in previous classes when we talked about programming and we talked about strings, that's the kind of way that we think about strings. We just take a character and we hang it on this string, and that's the way that our computer sees it. Our computer doesn't apply any meaning to these characters on their own. So on their own, these letters don't have any meaning. So on our website, before they're read, these letters don't have any meaning. It's the process that's going on in between the computer screen and the human, or whatever device screen, and the human brain, right, that's taking this group of letters that we've arranged together to represent a word and create a meaning in the mind of our users, right? That gets back to the whole idea of the things that we've talked about before, right? If you remember way back to like week 2 of the class, way back in, like first week of September, If you can remember that back that far, all the way back like 8 weeks ago, 7 weeks ago, however long ago it was now. And we had this idea that, UX design is magic, right? We don't actually do magic. We just create an environment in which magic can happen, and the real magic goes on in the minds of our users. And so really we can look at kind of typography in the same way. Right? Typography is magic. But really what we're doing is we're crafting characters and putting them on a screen in an environment in which we can most easily convey the proper meaning, so that when a user sees them and they're converted from just flashes of light on a screen into impulses in someone's brain, then they get the proper meaning out of them that they need. Right, so there is a lot of significance here. Now, there are many different types of fonts, as we've kind of mentioned. Some of them have some really different names. Right, serif, sans serif, headline, calligraphic, handwritten, display. We might see some different names for some of these things called different things. We'll look at a font. We'll look at a couple font sites in a little bit, and we'll see some different names for these different types of fonts later on. But, since there are basically thousands of fonts, it's important for us to take these fonts and put them into categories. Right? And so these font categories are our types of fonts here. And these different types of fonts, they do have different purposes for different uses. And typically when we use a serif font, and I like to say, they have the pokey bits on them. That's the best way for me to explain them to most people, right? Like if you look typically, at something like Times New Roman, right? And you look at the ends of different lines on a character in font of Times New Roman, it has a little pokey bit poking off of it, a little point. And that's a serif. So we say that is a serifed font when the characters have those little points coming off of them. When they don't have those points coming off of them, like the font that is making up the text on this slide right now, that is a sans serif font. And basic serif and sans serif fonts are typically used for body copy on websites. They're typically used for paragraphs, for large areas of text. Right, typically for serif, believe it or not, that's typically better used for printed pieces. And sans serif is typically better used for digital pieces. And sans serif is better used because things like aliasing and things of that nature interfere with the serifs, and it makes them look a little weird and makes the characters a bit harder to read for some people. Right, so in general we say serif fonts for print, sans serif fonts for the web. Right, which is why most of the time you'll just see me use a straight up basic font face sans serif when I create just a quick demo site. Right, when I do create a quick demo site and we use that font face sans serif, or font family sans serif. I got font face on my mind because we're going to be adding web fonts today, and that uses @font face. But font family sans serif, and that uses the default sans serif font of whatever browser or whatever system the user's on. So if they're on Windows, that's typically Arial. If they're on a Mac, that is typically Helvetica. Right, which there are slight differences between Helvetica and Arial, although they look almost the same. A headline font is typically one that wouldn't look great for body copy, right? Because maybe it's a bit thicker, or maybe it has some additional adornment that causes it to, maybe not render properly at smaller sizes, but it would look good in a bigger size, maybe for like a heading. Right? When we think back to our slab serif font that we looked at last week, when we see a serif font that uses really thick, chunky serifs instead of the tiny, pointy ones, we call those slab serifs. And those are typically, we might typically classify those as headline fonts, because they might not look great as body copy, because once we start using a bunch of lines of those really thick, really heavy fonts, it all will kind of jumble together and just get muddy and messy and look really bad. We don't want that. But if we use it just as a big headline type of font, it looks pretty good and works pretty well and draws your attention, creates that contrast, does a really good job. Then we have calligraphic or handwritten fonts. These are super popular nowadays, right, to do calligraphic or handwritten fonts, especially in print design and multimedia design. Not so much on the web, because they are still a little bit harder to read on the web. But maybe we'll try to use a bit of a calligraphic or handwritten headline font in our demonstration a little bit later. And display fonts. These are the type of fonts that we typically will use for displays, right? So when we think about say terminals, command prompts, they'll have a special type of font that goes along with them that you can install that is that has a bit of a different look to it. And even within these different types of fonts, right, we get all different sorts of fonts that come out of that, right? Like this slide here is just to show you all of the different letter cues that you could see from different fonts. And this is just a small sampling, right? There are hundreds, if not thousands, of fonts available. Thousands is probably the best terminology, if not hundreds of thousands of fonts available. And even though all of these fonts, I believe, would technically be classified as serif fonts, we can see all of these cues look incredibly different. Although it does have Edwardian script in there, which is a calligraphic font, so might have some different types of fonts in here. Just all sorts of different stuff kind of going on here, right? And we can kind of see it. But this is just to show you how we can kind of take something just as simple as the letter Q, right? And we can make a million of them. But they're all equally recognizable as the letter Q. In the old days, when you would buy a letter tray, you might get something like this along with it. This is a typesetting manual that would show you the font in different sizes, in all of its characters, in some different examples, with some different glyphs and some different special characters that are there with the font. This one in particular is for a font that is called Condensed Sans, or Condensed Sans Serif. And it's interesting to think about how much fonts have changed from what they were back in the manual typesetting days with the printing press, and how much really has stayed the same. Right? Because we still talk about things like tracking and leading. If you've ever seen that term, leading, it's not leading. By the way, it is leading. Although you might not know that unless you'd ever heard it pronounced. And that's actually a terminology that comes from the printing press days. In the web, we call it just line spacing. Right? Because it's the space between lines. In print design, they call it leading. It's the space between the lines. And it is called that because there were these standard size strips of lead that would be put between the rows of typeset characters to allow additional space between lines of text in the printing press. So in order to increase the amount of space between the lines, you had to increase the amount of leading that you had between your lines. So there's a fun fact for you for something that you might not have known. Leading. And so that's basically fonts in a nutshell, right? We'll get into how to use these fonts in just a bit. Let's talk about what is readability. Right, we've kind of mentioned already that when we're talking about readability, it's not just being able to read a site, right? Being able to read a site is one thing. We also have to want to be able to read the site. So if we see a big wall of text that's all in the site and it's all tiny and it's just a huge wall of tightly packed text and it looks like a lot to read. Right? Like I bet you all have seen something that looks like a lot to read. Whether it actually was a lot to read or not, just by the way it was formatted, it looked like a lot to read. Right, it's one thing to have a completely awful font that's maybe, too thick or too close together or too small that you really can't read it at its current size or in its current formatting. It's a completely different thing to have your text formatted in such a way that people don't want to read it. Right, because that can be fixed relatively easily. If we break up one big paragraph into smaller paragraphs with headings that separate different sections, that's one way we can do that. Right? We can throw some pictures in there. Right? We can change our line spacing, and we can add more spacing between the lines. That gives our eyes more visual rest area. If you'll remember back a couple weeks ago, we were talking about the idea of cognitive overload. And so if we have just all of these lines of text just all in there and tightly packed together with nothing else to sort of give our eyes a place to rest or to draw our attention away or give us, just kind of a place to stop a minute, that's going to cause cognitive overload, and that's going to give us a hard time. Right? There used to be kind of this rule of thumb where if you were going to get into newspaper design, they had the dollar bill rule. Right? Which is where you shouldn't be able to take out a dollar bill and put it anywhere on the page and have the dollar bill only touch one type of content, whether it was a picture or just text or whatever, right? Like it should be touching picture and text or title and picture or, two different articles or something, right? Like it should be, There should be something there to break it up, some kind of graphic, some kind of logo, some kind of picture, some other type of text, some other heading. You should stagger your articles to where they didn't line up to where, you might be reading across, right? Like that's one thing that people don't quite realize, right? And that gets into some of the crap principles that we were talking about last week, right? Is if I have article side by side, and I don't have any significant dividers between them, we read top, bottom, left, right. Right? So what's going to stop somebody from just keeping on reading across and thinking they're still in one article? It's just an article with columns that's a little weird. Right? So we want to be able to break things up, and we want to be able to minimize text when we can. Use lists, right? A list is something that's great when you can use it to minimize text. Oh, baby. Lists are great to take big blocks of text and make them way smaller. If you can avoid using a big block of text, avoid it. So what are some best practices for using type on the web? One is bigger is better. If you can make your font a little bit bigger, that's always preferable. Right? It's going to make it more accessible. Right? Like you can always have a user zoom in. But if they don't have to zoom in, that's going to make their lives a little bit better. And it's going to help you kind of have a unified design. It's all good. Don't cram your lines together. The longer the line is, right, across the page, if it's a super long line especially, space those things out. Give them more space, right? The longer the lines are horizontally, give them a little more space between your lines vertically. Try to make it attractive. Try to make it readable. Consider your user, and make sure you have that good contrast ratio between the foreground and the background. Now, let's talk about some ways to implement this stuff, because we can do that. So let's build a quick site here. Hold on just a second, everybody. I'll be right back. Sorry about that, everybody. Let's see, where were we? We were building a website. And we're just going to build something really simple, quick and easy today, just so we can just show how to do some web fonts here really quickly. And just deal with some type a little bit. So I'm only going to work with two different files today. It's going to be my index. Let's go ahead and throw that. HTML skeleton in there, and let's throw a style.css in here as well. Just a moment, everybody. Sorry about that again. Let's see here. Let's add a link here. Link rel equals style sheet. STYLESHEET. Href equals style.css. Type equals text/CSS. And for our body here, let's make a nice little section. We'll put an H1 in here, which will be, this is our heading. We'll try to do some nice refinement with all of this as well. And we'll put a paragraph in here. And just for our purposes for this demonstration, I would like to just use a little bit of lorem ipsum. So I'm going to go to lipsum.com and just generate a paragraph here of lorem ipsum dummy text. And we can just copy and paste really quickly here into our paragraph. So before we add any CSS to it, let's open this with our live server just to see what it looks like right now. Right, so by default, we've all seen this sort of font stuff before. Right, let's add a little bit of some styling here just to kind of make it look a little bit interesting. Let's add to our body a display of grid. Just to center up this section, I want to center it vertically and horizontally. Just do something a little bit interesting with it. We'll grid template columns. One frame. Justify content center. Align. Content center. And then for our section, actually we'll go ahead and put a background color on this as well. Background hashtag 252525. And on our section here, we will make this a min height of 60 VH. And we will aspect ratio 16:9. Right, so let's just save that. Have a look at our background color white. Is that doing what I want? It is kind of doing what I want. Not quite doing what I want. Let's set a width of, instead of setting the height, let's set a width of like 70% instead. And then let's add a little, let's add our HTML tag on here as well. I think I also need to do that if I want my whole site to be grid. Right? What am I missing? What if I got rid of the template? Justify self-center. Align self-center. There's always things we could do. Let's see if that'll work. That helps a little bit. Oh, you know what I have to do that I forgot to do? Height 100 VH. I need to set a height on body. Of course. Duh. Now it's centered up. On our asterisk selector, we'll box sizing. And we'll add a little padding to our section as well. Padding 24 pixels. There we go. So now we have a nice, this could just be a good landing page, right, for anything. And, another thing that we could do here really is just add some more to our paragraph here. So I'm just going to repaste that, that lorem ipsum again a couple times. Just so we can have that in there a couple times, like so. Right, so now you can see, like, these lines are pretty close together. Right, that's one thing. This text is all kind of small. In general, all these fonts are sans serif. I want to save our heading, or all these fonts are serif, rather. I want to save our heading. I want to use a self-hosted font for our heading. But for our body copy here, I would like to use a Google font. We can find this at fonts.google.com. Fonts.google.com. And there's all sorts of fonts here that we can use. And if we go to categories here, we can see the categories that they recognize. They have serif, sans serif, display, handwriting, and monospace. And so if we start to get rid of these fonts, right, here are their display fonts. Here are their sans serif fonts, which these will be the ones that we'll be looking at, that we'll be using for our body copy here. Here are their serif fonts. You can see kind of those little pokey bits that I was talking about. The little pointy bits. So I'm going to get into these sans serif fonts. And I'm just going to look through here and I'm going to find one that I like, that I think might work pretty good for this site. Noto Sans here is pretty good. You know, again, typically, you know, when we're looking for body copy, we're looking for something that's kind of inoffensive. We're looking for something that is easy to read. That, you know, this quicksand here looks like it might be pretty good. When we get into something like this Canet here, it's a little heavy, right? It's a little heavier weighted. Let's just kind of look through here. They have dozens upon dozens, if not hundreds of fonts here that Google hosts for us, right? To where we don't have to worry about hosting them, which is always great. So you just find one that you want. I think this assistant here looks pretty good. And then I'm gonna click it. And this is actually a variable font, so it's going to be a little bit different. But what I'm going to want to do is I'm going to want to look and see which style I want. Because typically, right, for most of these fonts, they're not just going to have the one weight. They're going to have multiple weights. Right, I have extra light, light, regular, medium, semi-bold, bold, extra bold. And you might want to use multiple of these for your site, right? So if I have, you know, basically if I'm using a strong tag, right? So let's try that. I might add both light by hitting the plus sign and bold to one thing. And then I can bring that in. And I like to use the import here. So it talks about use on the web here, and it gives you two options to use on the web. One is to use link, which gives you the link to a static CSS sheet that already has things in them. I like to use the import rule, however. And that just gives you a CSS rule that will import these into your already existing CSS sheet. So you'll notice there's a style tag and a closing style tag here. But since I'm in a CSS file, I don't need those style tags. So I can just copy this entire import rule and put it at the tip top of my CSS file. So I'm going to go up here, up above my asterisk selector, and just put that import rule. And so that's just going to go to this place on the web where this URL is. And it's going to import these fonts, and it is importing the 300 font and the 700 weight font. And so now in this section, I can say, okay, well, use font family assistant. And it actually gives me that code there that I can use, right? Font family assistant. It also gives me this font here, which is sans serif, which is the backup font, right? I put the primary font first, the backup font second. And I can say font weight 300, right? Because I have my choices of 300 weight and 700 weight. And so now if I look at my site, I see that I have that weight used here. Now, I used it on the section here instead of just the paragraph in the section, so I might want to move that out. Right, so I'll take and I'll copy this, or really I should cut this, right, and make a section, child selector, paragraph, and put that in there like so. And so now we have that font size nice and small right in there. Thin, nice, readable, right? We can make that font size a little larger, right? So let's take in our font size. We could use some of our things that we talked about previously, right? We could up that to like maybe 1.4 M to make that a little bit bigger. These lines, since they go a pretty far width across my page, the line height isn't quite tall enough, right? So I might want to adjust my line height here to maybe something like 1.2 M, right? Just to make my line height just a little bit taller. 1.2 M, maybe not quite enough. Maybe I'd want to go something like 1.4 M or maybe even taller, right? It's just going to depend situationally how much we'd want to do here. Let's try 1.8 M just so we can see it in action, right? Like we can really see that there. And hopefully you can see, like, as I give more space to my lines, I'm kind of giving my eyes a bit more room, right? To have a little bit of space to rest in between these lines of text. So all the text not squished in on one another here. It's all kind of spread out just a little bit. If I wanted to give a little bit more character spacing, which in traditional design terms we would call that tracking or kerning, right? In CSS that is letter spacing. And that's going to adjust the amount of space between the characters. And so this I'd want to use like a really small number, like 0.2 M or something like that, right? Because by default there's like a very, very small amount of spacing between the letters. So we see that when I use 0.2 M, like it spaces the letters out a lot. So I might want to use something like 0.05 or something like that to just give a little bit of space. Right, and this is an instance where you can use other things, right? Like if I wanted to use something like, okay, well, what if I added strong tags in here? So I'm going to take this section here, and I'm going to add strong tags around it. And if you'll remember back, we've talked about strong tags in previous classes. We say, strong tags are semantic tags that are used to identify, important words. Well, now I have strong tags here. And that's bold, but it's not specific bold, right? It's just bolded. If I wanted to address this and make it specifically bolded, well, I could take my strong tags in my CSS, and I could make this font weight, the 700 font weight that we brought in with our font family up here. Right, so now it's not just bold, but it's specifically bold. It's a specific font that has a specific level of boldness to it. If you make a font a little bolder, you might notice that maybe that letter spacing is maybe not enough anymore. Maybe it's too much, right? Well, now we can add special letter spacing just to this, right? So we can say, okay, well, let's take that letter spacing and actually let's shrink it down. Let's say, if it's bold, let's say we don't want any letter spacing there. We want that to just be tight. We could do that there as well, right? Or maybe we want it to be even more, right? Maybe we want to say, okay, maybe that's going to be 0.075 M. Just to have just a little bit more letter spacing. Because in general, like when you're looking at the spacing between letters, one of the things that we're kind of wanting to look at there is kind of the visual weight of the letters. And if we were to pour something into these letters, like how much water could we fill up in between these letters or something like that. And if it would be the same. Across, you know, the different letters, right? So we're getting a little bit more, a little bit fancier. Right, just by the nature of making that just a little bit special. Right, so now we've taken this block of text and we took those very narrow, very tightly compact, very difficult to read things. We made it a little bit lighter. We made it look kind of a little bit friendlier. It takes up more space on the screen, but it doesn't really look as daunting. Let's address that heading. For that heading, I actually want to download a font for it. So I'm going to go to defont.com. Right, and I think one of the things that I said I wanted to do with this is I wanted to use a calligraphic or some kind of handwritten font for this, right? So I'm going to go to their handwritten section here. And we're going to want to find like the right type of font for this. Because what you want is you want a WOFF font. And there are converters for that. So let's just, we'll just find a font and we will just kind of we'll use a converter to convert it to WOFF. And let's use this lemon yellow sun here. That's something that's, I think, good enough. It is, it's still like a sans serif font, but it is calligraphic. It's handwritten, right? It still has enough of a visual difference to where, like, it's going to look visually different than our other font that we've picked here. That is one big thing when you're thinking about choosing different fonts, right? You want to make sure that you are making a deliberate decision like we talked about last week with contrast, so it looks visually different, so it doesn't just look like you have, made this choice on accident. So let's see, this is an OTF font, and I'm going to use this Cloud Convert site here to convert this font from an OTF font to a WOFF font, which is what we want. And we'll give it a minute and let it do its thing. And so once it does its thing here, we're going to make sure we save it in the same directory. We'll probably change its name just so it's a little shorter and a little bit easier to deal with here. But you can do this with any font. And all I did to get to this Cloud Convert site here was just Google convert font to WOFF, because that's the type of font we want. I am going to download this font. I'm going to open it in the folder. And I'm going to copy it. And I am going to paste it in this project directory that I'm working in here. And I'm going to rename it just so I can have an easier time working with it. We'll call this sun.woff. And just so you can see it in the project directory, I'll drag over that project directory folder here. So this is how we do this. So we create an @fontface rule to be able to import this. And Really, all we're doing here is basically what Google already did for us here. If we were to go to this website here, Google's basically done for us what we're going to be doing when we create this at font face rule, right? Like this is our at font face rule. We have to give the font a name, we give the font a style, we can give the font a weight, right? We're just kind of giving it this information in sort of a rule here, right? So we're going to start with at font dash face and some semicolons, and we need, or not semicolons, but curly braces. And all we need to create a font face rule are 2 bits of information. The font family, which in this case, you know, it's just a name and we can name it whatever we want, right? I'm going to call it, what was the name of that font that we chose there? Yellow Sun, Lemon Yellow Sun. I'll just call it Yellow Sun. Yellow Sun. And the URL here, which is just, since it's in the same directory as this file, I can just call it sun.waf. And now I can do the exact same thing with my font family here for my H1. So section, child selector H1, font dash family is Yellow Sun, right? Because that's what I declared up here in my font face rule. So whenever it sees Yellow Sun down here, it's going to open up this font, and that's what that's going to be. So if we save this and we look at our site now, we can see that our heading is that font face, right? We can make it a little bit different. Font size, maybe something like 2.4 M. See what that looks like. Nice and big. Maybe even bigger, maybe something like 4.8. Let's just see what that looks like. That's looking pretty good. We got a lot of margin down here. We might want to adjust some of that margin, right? Maybe margin dash bottom. Maybe make that 2.4 M, just to see what that does. That makes it bigger. Maybe make it negative 2.4 M. That would cause margin collapse to occur. So that's looking good. Let's try 0. Just to see where 0 is at. 0 looks pretty good. And we could actually probably do it margin, just margin in general. That looks a little better. Maybe we could make the color a little bit different, right? It's our, you know, it's just going to work just like any other font. Maybe we can make that like some kind of dark yellow or you know, what would look, you know, the other color's a dark gray, right? So what would look good here? Let's see. Equal parts red and green is yellow. So if we were going to make a dark yellow, which is just like a weird brown, that's going to be something like hashtag 777700. We could probably even go lighter than that. Pretty cool. And if we wanted to, we can add some text decoration to that, right? Like, there's a lot of CSS rules that we can add to this. Letter spacing might be a good one to add here, since these letters are kind of close together. Maybe giving it just a little bit of letter spacing might be something that's nice to have here. Let's try 0.1 to see what that looks like. I like that a lot, actually. I think that looks pretty good. Let's do some maybe text decoration. What are our options in text decoration? I can never remember that. Google is our friend. Underline wavy might be interesting. Kind of cool. Right, lots of stuff that we can do there. This is just text, right? Like this is, this has had some care put into it. Now we might want to add a little bit of margin back, right? Like, so if we wanted to add some margin, a little bit of margin bottom back to that H1. Margin bottom 1.2 M. Might be worth it now. That's too much. Still probably too much. Let's try. That's about right. That's pretty good. Feel pretty good about that. Right, so here we've played with some different CSS text properties to take this text and make it more readable, both the ability to read it and the desire to read it, give you a little more, make it a little more reader friendly. We've added a font both with Google Web Fonts and with our own font that we downloaded from defonts.com. Right, we just used a converter to convert it to a WOFF and a WOFF and got it put onto our site. And this is also pretty great. Another thing that I've done with this before as well is used some glyph fonts, which this is going to give you some... This might give you something interesting to try to practice. Because especially, one of the things that we've kind of discussed in some other courses are like befores and afters and things of that nature. And if you've used what do you think you could do if you use like a font like this Summer Coast here? And maybe did that font with a before or an after. Or, used one of these glyph fonts with like a before or an after. And kind of placed that with, some of your text and had something really interesting there. Like that's something that you could, take advantage of and do something kind of really neat. I've used something like these arrows before, and a before and after to like have an arrow pointing at a heading. So like all of my H1s would have an arrow pointing at them, like like you could put this letter X in here. Maybe we can do that really. Why not? Let's try it. I think we have a... I mean, we've already gone over, so we may as well... May as well just do this one as well. So I'm going to take this font. This font is a TTF. So this is going to be a TTF. And I'm going to convert it to a WAF. We'll let it process. Download it. I will copy that into my project folder. This one we will rename to Arrows. So now in our project we will add a font face. We'll add a new @font-face rule. We'll call this one Arrows. And this will be arrows.waf. And so now I could take something like this H1 here, so I could say, oh, section H1 before content or what's the syntax? What's the syntax? It's just a string. Before content quotes uppercase X. Because if we look at our glyph palette from DeFont, we know that that's what that is, right? For the character that we wanted there. We can make it big. We could position it. Like we're supposed to. We could color it. Has it showed up yet? Let's have a look. There it is. We haven't given it our font family yet, so let's add our font family Arrows. And I want this to be not relative, but absolute. Right, so look at our arrow there. Let's make it smaller. 2.4 M. And we'll say left minus 2.4 M. Just to see what that looks like. Minus 48 pixels. That's too far over. Minus 12 pixels. Save. It's getting closer. Left 0. Getting closer. Left 24 pixels. Closer still, 48. What if we did like 2.4 M here? See what that looks like. That's too far. 1.2. That is the annoying part about this, is that you do have to do a little bit of guessing and checking when you're using befores and afters. At least I always do. There's probably somebody that's better at calculating this. There we go. That's pretty good. Top. That's going to push it down even further. So let's say like 0.4. Split the difference. Right, so now we have an arrow pointing at our heading, right? So we have this arrow pointing here. We can see it doesn't actually register as text because it was done in CSS, so we don't have to worry about the accessibility of it. And if we had another H1, it wouldn't quite work the same, right? But it's a good thing to call out a specific one, right? So we'd do this with like a class or something, and it would be pretty neat. But it's a good way to use this as a tool for this sort of thing. So that's another way that we can use a font to kind of jazz up our websites a little bit. Right, especially in this instance, since this arrow here kind of looks handwritten. Especially if we use the same color here, might be kind of interesting. If we change this color to be that same color, then we'd get that sort of thing. Kind of interesting, kind of cool. That's where we'll stop for today. We went way over for today, but we were interrupted a couple times there. I'll send you all this as well, just so you all can see this project. Thank you all for watching today. We'll turn on the music for just a moment, just in case anybody who is watching with me live has any questions. As always, thank you for watching. We'll see you next time.